Good afternoon, everyone. All right, you can
Good
hear me.
afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Hello.
Hey, Ebony, are you there? I think Ebony's going to be joining us a bit late. Ezekiel, are you?
I am here. I am here.
Right,
Good
all right.
afternoon. Hey, how you doing?
And then the last person, totally essential, is Javon. Javon, where are you at? All right. So, Javon, could we try to put the panelists view on? If we could, I don't know how to do that. I hope you can do that. To make sure that our moderator, 5 panelists are visible, or the only participants that are visible. We can do that. And then I'm going to go ahead and make a couple of housekeeping announcements. First, I think Javon has put some advice for everyone in the chat to, if you can, put either AQC or QCM before your name. So if you go to your profile where you see your face, you'll see 3 dots. I think you would click there, and then you could see how you can edit your name. Another way to do it, I think, is to go to, no, let's just keep it at that. I know there's a couple other ways to do it, but hopefully that'll work. Let us know if you have any problems doing that. I also want to take this opportunity to, do a little community building and give Javon a warm welcome. Since he's joined us in March, I know we announced it, but now you have a face with a name. Also, I want to say hello to Amma, who is our ICQCM scientist. I don't know if Lynette is on board, but she is based at Vanderbilt. By the way, Amma's at UPenn. And Lynette Parker, who is at Vanderbilt, is another one of our ICQCM core members. Morcia Hill may be on as well. And then, of course, the PIs. And Ezekiel's already said hello, and Ebony will be joining us shortly. I'm going to go ahead and share a slide just because there's one more update that I want to share with everyone. Let's see here. Just a few things that are coming up. Let's see here. If I can get this to go. There we go. So June 2nd through the 4th, there is a wonderful symposium of sorts being put together at Ohio State. It's the Advanced Methods Institute, and the reason why I'm bringing this to your attention is because it features quite a few ICQCM Institute fellows. So first, our own Veronica Velez, who is an Institute fellow, will be presenting there. Myself, I will also be there on day 2. And then also Sylvia Hurtado, she and I both will be doing keynotes. And then also, there's one other ICQCM fellow that's involved. And I'll get that information. I've blanked, but check out the agenda. It's a wonderful agenda. I don't know what the registration is like, but it is next week, and it seems like a wonderful opportunity. I also want to announce that finally, the ICQCM Scholars Forum is live. So you can go to the ICQCM website, and there it is expertly put together by Denise of Noir Light. I love working with her and her web branding. It's just amazing. There you'll find an opportunity to share any questions you have about methods. It's like a methods message board, but every time you post, I think everyone, at least this is the way it's supposed to work, everyone in ICQCM land will get a notification. So all of the Institute fellows, all 85 of the scholars, and all of our advisory board and personnel. And there we're supposed to kind of dialogue about critical methodology and ask any questions you have in, of course, a threat-free environment um, about methods and critical approaches to data analysis. Also, I wanted to mention that Javon sent out an email, I think last week, about the UPenn opportunity, the introduction to, and I know I've mistitled this, Ezekiel, my apologies, because policy is missing. I think policy is somewhere in this title, but nonetheless, it's the Introduction to Quantitative Data Analysis course that's provided to you free by University of Pennsylvania, and also the R Studio, an introduction that is provided via ICQCM, but housed at the Olin Library at Washington University in St. Louis. Both of those are really your introductions and go at your own pace tutorials, asynchronous opportunities for you to get acquainted with R, and also just to review the basics when it comes to data analysis. Okay, so I wanted to bring those two to your attention because when we move toward the electives in June, some of these skills are going to be prerequisite for some of the opportunities. Others, we will take you from the beginning. For instance, with Python, of course, you will need to know not only how to access the software, but then going forward, moving toward data analysis. So again, just want to bring your attention to those opportunities here. And I am going to pause because I'm like a train wreck sometimes. Ezekiel, Javon, what am I missing? Jump in here if I've overlooked something.
So, Otis, just real quick. The introduction to quantitative policy analysis is I did get a couple of emails about some glitches. I understand. So we're working on it. I'm in contact with my I forget their exact title, but they're the online person, online education person. So I'm working with them right now to try to address it. So those of you that have come across this issue, please hang tight, and we'll get it addressed quickly.
Javon, anything you need to jump in here and add?
You sound good to me so far.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the vote of confidence. So with that, we're going to transition to why we're here. I want to invite everyone to feel free to put questions in the chat box as we go. And also, you know, your amens, your seconds, your disagreements. We want to make this as interactive as possible. And we've really been fortunate to have every one of the individuals we invited to this panel to say yes. So I am super excited here to have our colleagues here. And yes, it's 6 individuals, so I'm not going to go into lengthy introductions. We've sent out their bios in advance so you can get a feel of the type of work they do and how accomplished they are. But I will say their names at least and how much appreciation I have for each. Brian Burt is a rising associate professor, just recently granted tenure at the University of Wisconsin. Congratulations, Dr. Burt. Cindy Jacoby is at the University of Alabama, and she also is an Institute Fellow. Dina Khalil is at Howard University, also an Institute Fellow, but also a member of the ICQCM Advisory Board. So we're really happy to have Dina with us. And then Adrian. So Dr. Dixon and I go way back when I was thinking about going to the University of Michigan for my doctoral studies, and of course ran into Adrian, who was there and gave me the 411 on Michigan at that time. And we've been just, you know, best buddies since then. And we were recently on another panel. So I'm so happy that she decided to join us. One of the great voices in critical race theory within the field of education. Veronica Velez. Now, We have not officially met, but she is one of our ICQCM Institute Fellows and one of our experts on intersectionality. So you may be seeing her at some point later in our electives lineup, should she say yes. So I'm kind of giving you a forewarning that we may be tapping you for that. And then also check her out at the Advanced Institute at Oak State next week. And then Edna Tan. And I forgot to say, Western Washington University. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier, Veronica. And then Edna Tan, who's at University of North Carolina, Greensboro. And we met at an NSF panel review, and she just blew me away with the wonderful way in which she advocated and critiqued some of the decisions that were before us in making funding decisions. And that's really important for us in terms of our professional development, and having her voice in that room really changes things. So I want to voice my strong appreciation for her, and then also tremendous thanks for her joining us. And she's at University of North Carolina, Greensboro. So I think I've done all of the introductions. If I've gotten anything wrong, please let me know. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Burton.
All right, thank you again for inviting me and allowing me to not only participate as moderator, but also to learn from these brilliant scholars. As just a setup, I don't necessarily know that I want to go one by one for every question. And I can't actually see, I see everybody. So for those on the panel, I'm probably going to ask that you jump in and let's try and make it more conversational instead of so fixed. Because also I don't want to put anybody on the spot if you don't want to answer a question. So looking at the time, we're going to probably spend about 30 minutes doing this large group discussion. And then we'll spend about 20 minutes in breakout rooms. And every breakout room will have a couple of the panelists in those breakout rooms. We'll do that for about 20 minutes. And then we'll come back together as a full group to process and have any large group conversations and talk about what we learned collectively or any other burning questions that everybody may have. And then I believe that Otis again is going to close us out. Right, Otis? Perfect. All right, so let's just get started. And I will, for everybody who might be posting on the chat, I have a few prepared questions, but if you have additional questions or places that you want clarification, I'll be monitoring the chat as well. So kind of just like to get us started, panelists, how do you define critical work?
I'll start. This is Adrienne. I think critical work, I actually just had this conversation with a teacher, a classroom teacher in New Orleans. I think critical work is work that raises questions that we typically don't ask. So one of the hallmarks that I loved about being trained at Wisconsin, I'm a Badger, is to always, what is the question that hasn't yet been asked, is the premise. And then what's missing from answers that we've typically been given, whose voices don't we hear? And as a critical race theory scholar, I really draw very heavily on this notion of those at the bottom. So what are the perspectives of those at the bottom that often are invisible or eclipsed or just muted in large part because we refuse to listen to them or believe that people who are quote unquote on the bottom have a perspective that's worth listening to. So that's how I define critical work. And I think it's important for people who are not academicians, graduate students, to think of critical work as not being mean or being offering a critique just for the sake of the critique. But there's always, I tell my students, there's always something that we're not yet seeing, and that's what the critical scholar does. That's certainly what a critical race theory scholar does, is how are perspectives of those who are the most marginalized rendered invisible and unseen, and how do we help to raise visibility of those perspectives and center them. So that's my definition.
Similarly to Adrienne, hi, I'm Cindy. I am about the stories, and the stories that we don't tell, the stories that we don't see, the underlying assumptions that we make that we don't know that we make, and exposing and untangling those from white supremacy. I also want to say that my particular toolkit for critical race work is decolonial work and criticism and rhetoric of post-empire. So those are my takes on critical theory. And I also wanted to add to that, as a graduate student, I didn't know what all these things meant, and I thought other people did and I didn't. So please ask questions. Thank you.
I can jump in here really quick. I feel just to kind of add to what's been said. I often tell my own students that, we oftentimes tend to conflate, to kind of Dr. Dixon's points here, we tend to conflate critical with critique as sort of the same thing. And yes, there is a bit of sort of unpacking and sort of disrupting particular ideologies that we oftentimes assume to be moral, right, and good in what we do. But it's a bit more than that. So I often tell students that, engaging in critical work is more than just acquiring new information to determine what facts are true or not true. It also involves determining the social, historical, and political underpinnings or meanings that are given to those facts. So it's really about understanding what we see, what's below the surface of what we assume to kind of, see in the world, and really kind of unpack that. To me, I always think about that underlying all this for me as an aspiring critical scholar is someone who really is attuned to questions of epistemology, ontology, and axiology. And I know those are big terms. I always tell students, like, the easiest way, and I know this is a huge oversimplification of it, but epistemology is how do we come to know, ontology, how do we come to be, and axiology, what do we come to value, right? And so I think those three things for me, at the core of all sort of understandings of the world, are those three, how do we unpack that in our work? And that's not just simply in the outcomes, especially as researchers and scholars, like how can our work move, toward more critical ends? It's got to be embedded throughout your entire way of engaging the work, right? So, what kinds of epistemologies are we grounded in to think about the questions that drive our inquiry or drive our thinking? So that's how I would understand, to kind of push those at the core of that. For me, I always have to think about epistemology, ontology, and axiology when I think about critical work is really core for me.
I'll ride on my colleagues' coattails. I agree with everything that's said. I also think that critical work for me is work that is complex. It's not something that has easy solutions to, and it's work that should make researchers uncomfortable when you are embedded on site. I like to tell my students that critical work should focus on power differentials as more than just a context. It's not just a background, right, against which your work is doing. It is the work in which you both feed in, you're enmeshed in. And a lot of times, as much as we want to be as authentic allies as possible, there is no way, even if we are engaged in longitudinal work with communities, to understand and empathize to the degree, right? Because we're not in their skins, we're not walking in their shoes. We're doing as much as we can to be in the space that they're in so that we can use the rest of our senses. So I like to use this, I was a science teacher. I like to tell my students that when you read or when you listen or when you look at videos, you are really limiting your senses of observation. And which is why my preferred methodology is longitudinal participatory ethnography. I like to be in the space to understand really how, systemic injustices are manifested in very particular, very local ways that are hidden and mundane that we don't necessarily see unless we are sort of like steeped and stewing, right, in that context for a really long time. And that is really important because ultimately, at least for me, I speak for myself, with the communities I worked with for more than a decade, I'm still an outsider, right? They call me an outsider insider. happily, a lot of the youth call me Auntie Edna. So I've gained some sort of trust and relationship with them, but ultimately I'm still an outsider. And keeping that in mind, I feel it's really important, and always seeking re-entry, always seeking for myself, right? The asking for the right to be there, right? To walk alongside is something that I don't take lightly, that I try to incorporate as a core integral part of the research methodology and process.
Thank you. I was taking some notes. One thing I really appreciate from you all's first response was that you all, in describing not only what critical work is for you and how you do it in your work, you all described different approaches to doing critical work, whether it be from ethnography. I also heard post-colonial investigations and other types of approaches. But I think what's important that I was taking from that is, one, that there's not a one size fits all. There's not just one way of being critical or doing critical work, right? And I think that that's going to be extremely important, that we're not necessarily saying that there's a formula of it must look a particular way, but that we can be doing it from different approaches and it can still be critical. And so we'll probably revisit that. I have a particular question, a few questions that are actually related to the epistemology, the ways of knowing conversation, but I'm going to come back to that because I'm looking at the clock and I have some provocative questions that I want to get to. So over the last year or so, actually, we've seen attacks on science. We've even seen attacks on particular kinds of knowledge, for example, critical race theory, just as one example. So what would you say to those people who are critical of critical approaches to knowledge?
That's a really hard question, Brian.
I was going to break the silence and say, this is a hard one.
It's a hard one, and I'll throw out a half-baked non-answer. I guess that's for me, your third question about white supremacy, which I'm sure we're going to get to, and what that means for each of us as critical researchers. I would say that it's a warm-up question. Thank you for warning us. For me right now, like, I would see whether the person who is critical of critical work is within reach, or beyond reach, or whether I am the right person in the color of skin that I'm in to be able to reach. Because I think that differentiates my response, right, towards who is being critical about what and why and when and around what issues. This is why I think a coalition of critical scholars in all our hues is so important, because there are more people that you can reach. There's some people that I can reach. We reach them in different degrees and in different ways and different kinds. So in the same way, Brian, as you said, there's no one size fits all. There's no one size fits all for this really complex question that you're asking as well. And I would venture to say that this work is mentally draining, emotionally draining. We all know that. And so being very clear in how you categorize who you might be most effective with whatever energy you have, right, in convincing this critics, right, who may just be taking up air and remaining in the realm of ideology, but not having any kind of on-the-ground impact, whether your energy is my energy is better served in channeling it to real work on the ground, or engaging in these kinds of, conversation with colleagues in academia that I'm never going to convince.
So I want to answer that question, which I don't think it was a hard question at all. I just didn't want to be first. So thank you for the question, Brian. I think it comes with the territory when you challenge traditional knowledge framing, the way knowledge is framing, or the nature of knowledge, and your perspective is outside of the kind of mainstream orthodoxy of how one should know and how one should do, it's going to, people are going to be uncomfortable. So as a critical race theorist, this is not the first time that folks have been uncomfortable or critical of the critical. It just comes with the territory. I think that I would say that all knowledge is political. So what we value is political. It's a reflection of knowledge systems that are tied with power, epistemologies that are linked to power. So that my system of knowledge or way of knowing, my epistemology may not be one that's similar to those who have power, but it is it's a way of knowing. So that we can, we have to have space for different ways of knowing and being. And I don't know, my truth isn't everyone's truth, but it is the truth that I have as I have experienced it. So I studied New Orleans and ed reform in New Orleans. And ironically, the people in power are often casting the stories of those who have the least power, so people of color, mostly disenfranchised people of color, as being untrue and inaccurate. And that the research that I had one person, I gave a talk at a university that's very tightly connected to ed reformers, and he described my work as investigative reporting. that I wasn't actually doing research. I was doing investigative reporting because I was sharing the stories of families, of mothers, of children, of teachers whose stories about New Orleans ed reform is different than you would see in even some of our kind of mainstream academic journals, but certainly on NBC's Education Nation. Or that's promulgated by ed reform organizations like Teach for America or large charter schools. And so, we had to agree that we have a different set of epistemologies, and that what he was actually demonstrating is that he lives in that there's a certain way of research, a certain form of research that resonates with him, but that we just operate in different paradigms. And so rather than being insulting, he could accept that my work has a different perspective than his, and that he would never, be welcome to talk to the people that I talk to. So I like Edna. I don't spend a lot of time trying to convince anyone of anything. I don't think that that's my role. I think because as a critical race theorist, my work and my mandate is to make visible racial inequality as experienced and shared with me by those, again, on the bottom. And so I'm not attempting to persuade anyone that the stories are true. The stories are. They exist. The experiences are. That's what people have. That's how they've lived, and that's the nature of my work. And again, it's not to persuade or to convince anyone to agree, to accept. I'm not committed to that kind of work.
Go ahead, Cindy. I think you had your hand raised first. You're on mute. You're on mute.
There you go. I wanted to say that I recently had a similar conversation with my dean. I should back up and say my context is that I'm at the University of Alabama, which is a white supremacist institution. It knows it is, and it has an assortment of narratives about itself, about how it's trying to address its white supremacy or how it isn't. And I have all the stories, but my dean recently described my critical work as activism, not as research, but as activism. And I was taken aback and I didn't know how to respond to that. And I was pretty angry about it for a while. But what I think I learned from that instance is that one of the things that makes people uncomfortable about critical race work is they see it as activism trying to rewrite the knowledge and narratives that they know. And that makes them uncomfortable. It makes, they don't like the, it's destabilizing. And so of the norm. And so I think I pick my battles. I certainly don't think it's my job to retrain the dean, but I will talk to people who ask me, on social media, if they'll ask my opinion. I will talk about it, but not at the institutional level. No, it's too much work for me.
So I'll just quickly respond and give maybe a concrete example of some evidence that I use, right, in kind of response to this question. So I think when I hear that question, I hear that the sort of the underlying assumption that the person asking the question, the person who's critical of critical work, is this assumption that their position is somehow objective or neutral, and that the critical work is the biased or somehow, passionate position, right? I mean, I often get, so to think about the qualifiers, like we're often phrased when we bring up critical theorizing or critical work, it's like, oh, Vettel's really passionate about students, BIPOC students or students of color. So, you have the sort of ways that we're labeled, because there's an assumption that says that their position somehow is free of any sort of ideology, free of any politics, right? And so, we can often get into this conversation about, okay, well, maybe in the areas of history or sociology, or, name the kind of what we often, my students call the fuzzy fields, right? The ones that can provide, engage multiple worldviews. Okay, we can understand where critical work can fit in that. But the hard sciences, right, is where people are like, nah, like that can't possibly it. And so I always share the work of my dear colleague, Dr. Philip Stevens at the University of Idaho, who does work on Apache mathematics. And I'm always struck when he shares his work, right? Because, he talks a lot about Apache youth who grew up on the San Carlos Reservation in Arizona, who every summer have to harvest mesquite. And he's like, if you know anything about mesquite, when you harvest mesquite, mesquite's a really twisty, it's a windy wood, it's not straight. And so Apache youth from a very young age begin to learn what he calls a third plane Eclusian tessellation mathematical modeling of the world. It's those really complex ways that Apache youth come to understand mathematical concepts and mathematical understandings, because they have to figure out how to load a bed of a truck in a particular way to understand how mesquite can be loaded. But what we teach in school is this kind of two-plane, a much simpler version. It's a two-plane Eclusian tessellation model of the world. So when they start going to school, Apache youth begin to see themselves as, quite frankly, sucking at math, when they're actually, in many ways, mathematical geniuses, right? And so I use that example because even in math, we can understand how epistemology is playing here, that actually there is no neutral positioning. Everything is rooted in a particular understanding of the world. Hence why critical work is so important, so we can understand. And also for those of us who are committed to thinking about how then when do we provide a place for Apache youth to see themselves in math and science, that these are still questions of criticality, questions of critical work. So Philip Stevens is always my go-to, because I'm like, all right, I get you social studies, but let me give you an example of mathematics and why that matters. And I think that tends to be sort of my evidence sometimes in kind of responding back. And usually that kind of quiets folks, but ultimately people on that end will always continue to hold that position regardless of what evidence you throw their way anyway. So kind of to echo my colleagues, some battles are just futile, but Philip Stevens' work is on Apache mathematics stuns me in this way, because I think he exposes, even in those sciences, the hard sciences, how epistemology is still at play. So thank you.
I appreciate how the thread along all of you all's responses was this notion of power. And so not that I want to amplify any more than normal, but I think we can't really talk about what we do in this type of work without talking about white supremacy. So what is most important in this very white supremacy field? I mean, everything is guided by white supremacy and power structures. What is most important in this current moment about a critical scholar's work in and outside of the academy, taking into consideration this notion of white supremacy?
one of the things that I think is important to consider is that all of our contexts that we work in are white contexts, that the white supremacy that underpins our institutions is, well, all of our institutions are built on unceded Indigenous land, right? So immediately we're in a state of occupation, we're in a place of occupation, and then those institutions are built on white supremacist ideals, white supremacist knowledge making, white supremacist power. And I think it's really important to understand that we claim our spaces, that we set context for our students and for ourselves that are not those supremacist ways of being and knowing, that we teach storytelling, we teach Apache math, we teach hypertext and wampum, we teach all of these things for students and for ourselves that make the space non-white, I guess I want to say, or at least expose the underpinnings of the supremacy that we inherently occupy and is acting on us at all times when we are teaching and learning.
Dr. Bird, I wanted to jump in here just because after hearing the question, I do understand some individuals wouldn't see themselves as reactionary or responsive to white supremacy, but instead would want to center their own communities and identities and ancestries and histories. So I just wanted to acknowledge that, that is, the epistemology that some of us are working with, and my error in writing the question in that way, because it shouldn't have precluded anyone answering, the challenge we have with dominant voices and power, which an answer might be actually centering us instead of centering them. And so I just wanted to kind of put that out there as my apology.
No. I mean, I was thinking, I think the question is actually hits at a lot of, I mean, we're in the middle of, quite frankly, I mean, the backlash, the attack on critical race theory, I mean, we're living it right now. And so I think we have to ask this question. I think we have to tackle it. I mean, we're under attack in so many ways. I can't say for my colleagues, but I know the level of hate mail, the level of surveillance, people dropping into my classes to see what I'm teaching, how I'm, I can go on and on in terms of the current attack we're all facing. Simply, and at the end, at the core of this, and I think you named it so well, Dr. Johnson, this at the core of this, it's about joy and humanizing. It's about possibilities and future, futures in the best way. I mean, this is why we're here. I always say, so much of the work in critical race theory and the work we do around criticality, yes, it is about dismantling systems of power and oppression and thinking about how that is at every phase of our work, but it's also ultimately about our humanity and about, justice work is about joy and happiness, right? And so I think on some levels, how do we understand these projects? And I think in real ways that should be what informs how we enter research, how it informs how we enter the kinds of questions we're asking, the kinds of what we teach in our classrooms. I mean, all of that. So, but I think we cannot dismiss, we would be remiss not to mention that we are in this middle of a battle, right? And I think you mentioned our communities have, in many ways, that come from spaces that have been critical about a lot of things for a very long time, right? And so this is in many ways nothing new. These battles are nothing new. But at the same time, I think asking those questions, what does it mean in this moment to whether it's critical race theory or Chicana feminisms or critical spatiality, which is some of the things, right? What does it mean to center that work unapologetically in a context that is seeking to, quite frankly, dismantle, surveil, attack us, right? How do we hold on to that? What are the kind of, and I think Edna said this beautifully, what are the coalitional politics that we need to be doing in our work to ensure that we are working in support of these kinds of projects? So I just wanted to echo that and just kind of stress that no apologies needed. I think that the question is right on, particularly for this moment, I think are important that we ask.
I agree that it's really tension filled. We are living and we are caught in white supremacy. So my class read James Baldwin recently, and one of the quotes that he said is that, you've been taught that you're inferior, right? If you're not a white male person, heterosexual person, you've been taught that you're inferior, so you act as though you're inferior. And on a level that is very difficult to get at, you really believe it. And of course, all the things you do to prove you're not inferior only really prove you are. They boomerang, because it is that system that is not built for you, that you're trying to fit in, right? And there's no way you can fit in. And then he says, you're playing the game according to somebody else's rules, and you can't win until you understand the rules and step out of that particular game. So there is this essentiality to understand the rules, right? So it's not as if, and it's so difficult to negotiate. It's not as if we can turn our backs because we are in it. It's like we're fish in the water. But how do we stay, at least it's a question I ask myself, how do I become and I wrote this down based on your question, a clear-eyed, hopeful cynic. I want to be a clear-eyed, hopeful cynic. And what does that mean in terms of my teaching and my research and my service? Clear-eyed so that I understand the rules and know what it is that the powers that are still entrenched are trying to do. And a lot of things that they try to do is to cause BIPOC groups to fight amongst ourselves, right? In different ways, right? For me, the Asian model minority myth plays out in such tired and just god-awful ways. Hopeful because this is the world we're in, right? This is probably not gonna be addressed in our lifetimes, but we have to keep chipping at it. So how do we remain hopeful? But again, still be a cynic, right? Always questioning, always looking for complex things, always not assuming that things are what they seem because they never are. And so I think it's really tiring to be living in white supremacy and fighting against white supremacy, but there's no other way to exist. And so I think, coalitions are really important. Taking time for yourself, which is a really difficult concept for me, this whole self-care thing, which I think is very young people trope, is important for critical scholars. I think being willing to ask difficult questions wherever we are in the academy is important. And that comes with risks and political backlash, either where you're a grad student, junior faculty, wherever you are in the rank, it can come back and bite you. And a really personal question that I ask myself is, what is the price I'm willing to pay?
Thank you. So I just saw a very great question in the post. If you all have the opportunity to look at your chat, there's a larger question, but the premise at the end is, how do people doing critical work, how do we negotiate the tensions between not just dismantling and disrupting, but also building and constructing, or rebuilding and reconstructing? I believe that that's the essential aspect. But what I'm going to ask us to do is, perhaps if we can go into our breakout rooms and tackle that question as one of other topics that you all want to discuss, but perhaps that can be a starting question that you all have conversations within your breakout room. Is that good? Or Adrian,
well, I don't want to talk. Yep, I don't want to talk about that question. I don't want to talk about rebuild, because I think that the bigger issue of this, white supremacy is an ideology that has existed before us. It's not going anywhere. And so what are we trying to dismantle and rebuild in the context of white supremacy? I don't think that's the question. And I actually honestly never want to spend my time with any group of people that I care about figuring out how to build something, how to take something down and rebuild it in the context of white supremacy, because I think that's not a good use of our energy. I will say that that what I tell my students is to just be prepared for the okie doke. That's how white supremacy works. It's always going to show up in the okie doke. So, you know, again, it exists and there's no place in the world we can go that hasn't been touched by the ideology of white supremacy. None of us are protected from it. What we have to be conscious of is how much we've internalized it. And that we, you know, Gloria Ladson-Billings always said, you find a job where you can do your work. And because I'm not independently wealthy, I have to work. I need my check to come every month. I get paid once a month at the University of Illinois, and I need my check to deposit to hit on the 16th of every month. So that's the context in which I live. But the work I do is, I'm not trying to make the University of Illinois a anti-racist, non-white supremacist institution. It is, because it will find a way to reinvent itself. Look at how it's co-opted diversity, equity, and inclusion. So now everybody and their mama, because these people went out and just started wholesale killing Black and brown people, now universities are scrambling to hire diversity and equity people. And what are they going to do? Nothing, because their jobs are not to make it better for people like me. It's to keep universities out of lawsuits. That's what they're designed to do. So nothing is getting rebuilt, dismantled, none of that. So we have to understand that this is what we call racial realism in critical race theory language. You have to understand the context in which you live. White supremacy has existed for, if we just mark it in US times, over 300 years. It ain't going nowhere, but you still got to do your work. But I'm not trying to rebuild nothing inside the context of white supremacy. I'm trying to make sure that my people survive. And by my people, I mean people of color, that we survive and that we are able to keep it moving. And I love Bettina. I know she wrote a book, We Want to Do More Than Survive. But surviving is important within the context of historical and brutal white supremacy that manifests all the time. I'm fortunate that I work and I get a check to do what I do. So I want to be clear about that. But University of Illinois is going to exist whether Adrienne Dixon is there or not. And it's going to keep on keeping on whether Adrienne Dixon is there or not. And so my work has to be outside of that, and it's not to rebuild the University of Illinois. That's not going to happen. The University of Wisconsin, as much as I love it, it's still going to be white ass University of Wisconsin. That's just what it's going to be. So I would rather talk about some other stuff. I don't want to talk about building and rebuilding in the context of white supremacy.
Yeah, I would just, can I just add something? So like, one of the things that Dr. Dixon is saying here that's so powerful that I've been, echoing. I mean, we can get into a whole conversation about, particularly as I can speak of, I've been kicked out of one college, we can get into all the ways that these politics play out in the same way that I feel like I've never been so desired and discarded at the same time as a Chicana on my campus. I mean, and to think about this, the pattern happens over and over again, right, in the work we do. But I would say that part of what, the questions I'm asking now, especially when it comes to this question of transformation, and that goes in transformation in terms, again, across all the different roles we wear, that it's, what I had, come into out of doctoral training, this belief, right, that transformation institutions could be transformed. It's this idea that, maybe the question of transformation isn't about how do we transform institutions, but about how do we transform our relationship to those institutions. Because fundamentally, if we think about, what does it mean then to recalibrate? And I've had to do that myself as, what does it mean to return back to investing in the kinds of relationships with community and authentically, and this is complicated, right? Because we are contradictory in a lot of ways how we walk in this. But I think to be able to say, what does it mean to engage in work and relationship to the folks that are outside of those institutions become more important now more than ever, right? Because we are these sort of colonial logics that continue to be thrown at us, right? Around every mission statement now has justice in its title, and it's become so bankrupt in the ways that we understand this work. How does that shape the kinds of questions we need to be asking now in terms of our scholarship? What are we seeking to reconcile with the university or any system, right? And so I think about what does that mean then in terms of what transformation, what theories of change should undergird how we think about transformation, and how does then that shape the way we enter our work, enter our classroom, enter our service, right? Because I've like stopped doing, service for any sort of diversity committee. I like run from, like, do not any sort of diversity and equity committee. But you think about the way that plays out, right? So I just wanted to kind of throw that. So thank you, Dr. Dixon, for kind of bringing that back to the space and to kind of opening up that, because it shapes not just, it shapes, everything is driven by our politics, but it shapes our inquiry too. And I want to just be clear that it has definitely shaped the way I think about research and inquiry moving forward.
Dr. Burt, we've hit this wonderful moment, right? And I hate for it to end, but I want to respect also some of the scholars that probably would like smaller group engagement. So I don't know. It's totally up to you and how, because if we want to continue down this road, we can keep us together and just open it for general comments and discussion, or we can have smaller group. And I'll also defer to Ezekiel if he has any thoughts about us just having Q&A now or going into smaller groups and having discussion.
I mean, I'll defer to Brian and how Brian would like to move it forward. I mean, I do think there is an energy right now, but we can move that energy into the small groups, or we can keep the energy in the large group going, and and then move to the small group. So it's up to you, Brian.
I'm going to give it. I mean, you all are on fire with the questions and the reactions right now. And so I want to acknowledge that there are different ways that people learn and process. So perhaps let's take 15 minutes in the small groups, and this might generate some more questions and allow some people to process a little bit better. So let's go into the breakout room until I think 5:15 is you all's time. And then we'll come back as a large group for any final Q&A that generated from the small groups.
And I hope Javon has already situated everyone. Are you ready, Javon? All right. Okay, here we go.